Welcome to Know Your Pension. This is a sort of education session aimed at giving people the information that they're going to need with the coming USS pension dispute, so that when people mention things to you about your pension, you know what they're talking about and you don't get confused by any of the terms. So we've got quite a few speakers. You'll probably know quite a lot of them. Thank you to all our speakers for volunteering their time. We're going to rattle through this fairly quickly, but each chunk is a fairly small bite-sized chunk. So hopefully you'll all get something out of it. And if you have questions on any of the parts, can you put them in the chat, and we'll have a very short bit for questions after each part. So if you have questions about things you don't understand, then we'll take questions at the end. Unfortunately, we don't have time for speakers from the floor tonight, but there is an event after the sector conference at which we will have a more fulsome debate, I think. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to the chair for the first part, Deborah Kerfoot. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome to colleagues on tonight's session. The first group of speakers are giving an overview, your pension, and as has been said, we have about 20 minutes for this section, with 6 speakers with just a couple of minutes each, just to give you a brief overview of our discussion topic. If anyone wants to ask a question, if you can put it in the chat box, as has been said, but please make sure you confine your questions to the topic material that's been covered. If you have a different kind of question, it's very likely to be covered in a later section. Okay, our first speaker is back to Sarah Joss, who's going to talk about defined benefit.
Okay, I'm going to speak to you a little bit about defined benefit schemes. First of all, for contrast, a defined contribution scheme. It's more like a savings scheme. Your money goes into a pot, it's invested in funds, and that makes timing a factor because those funds can either be performing well or not so well when you retire, and that affects the size of your pot. The risk is individualised. It's your own pot, and it's up to you to make sure that pot lasts you for your retirement. We all know there's a pay gap. Well, this also exists in pensions, and a defined contribution scheme actually makes that pay gap worse. Defined benefit scheme, in contrast, provides a guaranteed, that's a defined annual income every year in your retirement, no matter how long that is. The risks are shared and backed by the employer, and it still mirrors the equality pay gap, but it doesn't make it worse. Now, for the USS scheme, that's called the Retirement Income Builder. It's a career average scheme as opposed to what it once was, a final salary scheme. The contribution rate is how much you pay in and how much the employer pays in, and your bit is paid in before tax. The accrual rate is how much you are adding to your annual income in retirement every year. So at the moment it's 1/75th of your salary for that year gets added onto the annual income that you get every year you're retired. And the salary threshold is the level at which contributions go into the defined benefit scheme. Above that level, they go into a separate defined contribution scheme. So I've given a couple of examples here. On a salary of £30,000, all of that is going into the defined benefit scheme and adding £400 a year to your annual retirement income. For a salary of £70,000, some of your contribution is going into the defined benefit, some of it is going into the defined contribution. It goes in at a lower contribution rate, 8% to you, 12% to the employer. And so the maximum that you can add each year to the guaranteed annual income is £798, which is the threshold divided by 75.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Just a reminder to colleagues and to anyone listening that tonight's session is being recorded. So if you'd like to hear some of the contributions again, then you'll be sent a link. A link will be made available for you to play over this broadcast at your leisure. Our second speaker is Tim Wilson, who's going to talk to us about the pension valuation.
Hello, everyone. Every 3 years, the trustees have to ask themselves a question. Do they reasonably expect to be able to pay the pension promised with the assets they hold? And so they need to do a valuation, and they determine the amount of assets they've got simply by looking at the market price of those assets. But the liabilities are rather more difficult. They need to project forward how much they will expect to pay in pensions. And in order to do that, they need to make assumptions about the longevity of the people in the scheme and about the rates of inflation to occur in the future. And then they've got to, and here I put up USS's projections for the 2020 valuation, starting in 2020 and going through until early in the new century, and sum is £137 billion. But now they have to put a value on that, that is the current value for on the day of the valuation. And to do that, they need to get a discount rate. Now, a discount rate is essentially a reverse interest rate. £100, and we compound the interest over a series of years to find out how much money we have in the future. For a discount rate, we're doing the reverse. We know how much we need in the future, and we do the same calculation in reverse, coming back to the current year, to work out how much money we need now in order to have that amount in the future. And so you see, just like in an interest rate, if the interest rate is higher, you end up with more. With a discount rate, if the discount rate is higher, you need less money now in order to reach that same point in the future. If the discount rate is lower, you need more money now than to get the same point in the future. In order to make that calculation, the trustee needs to make decisions on the investments they hold and assumptions about the yield those investments will give. To do the same thing for future service, it's essentially the same calculation, but you also need to make assumptions about the demographics of the scheme, the way the sector will grow, and the number of opt-outs there will be. And so you can see that in order to determine the valuation, there are a large number of assumptions and choices that the trustees must make about how they expect the future to pan out. There we go.
Thank you, Tim. Just a reminder for anyone who's just joined us that tonight's session is being recorded, so you'll be able to play it over at your leisure at a later date. The link will be available. Our third speaker is Deepa Driver from Reading, who's going to talk to us about the pensions regulator and the role of the pensions regulator.
Thanks, Deborah. My name is Deepa. I'm one of the national negotiators for UCU, and I'm also on UCU's NEC. And I'm going to tell, my day job is as an academic teaching regulation. I used to be a regulator a long time ago. And the pensions regulator is a very unique regulator unique in the sense that it's got a particular position within the landscape in that its focus is solely on pensions. Most other financial products are either regulated by the Prudential Regulation Authority or the Financial Conduct Authority. But the pensions regulator is specialist based in Brighton. You don't need to know where it's based, but what's interesting about it is that it has certain statutory objectives, just like any other regulator has. And what you would have seen if you saw my slides is amongst these statutory objectives, the pensions regulator's very important objective is something called the protection of the Pension Protection Fund. And the PPF is the equivalent of what your depositor protection within normal deposit schemes. When you put in your savings, you know that if your bank goes bust, the government will cover you up to a certain amount. And the Pension Protection Fund is a similar fund where if your DB pension scheme isn't able to cover your pensions or fails, then the pensions regulator wants to make sure that any schemes which could potentially go into the PPF, that's the Pension Protection Fund, do so in a reasonable way. So what they're trying to do is protect the public purse, and this guides quite a lot of what the pension regulator does. Another thing that guides what the pension regulator does is a desire to ensure that employers are sustainable in the long term. Now, unlike most other regulators who have a broader consumer protection objective, an objective to look after the interests of, for example, scheme members in this case, the pensions regulator doesn't, in its statutory objectives, have such an explicit goal, which means that what it cares about is something called accrued benefits. That's what you've saved to date. And in terms of the future, what it cares about is whether the pressures of the pension scheme are putting such a burden on the employer that the employer says they're not able to sustainably grow. This is part of a very business-friendly kind of Tory logic that, is based on the individualization of risk and a desire to make sure that regulators are working in the interests of employers. What this does is it makes sure that the pensions regulator doesn't take account of the fact that the scheme needs to be sustainable and open to members in the long term. And so the pensions regulator focuses on two things. One thing is called, and by consequence, USS as the pensions trustee focuses on something called the long-term funding target, which is also known in the industry as self-sufficiency, which is the removal of a reliance on the employer contributions and the employer covenant, and a desire to make sure that things are certain in the long term. So these are the, I don't know why that keeps pinging. I'm very sorry, I don't know where that noise is coming from. So given these are the two constraints that the pensions regulator puts on USS, the scheme trustee, we have to think about what it is that the trustee is focused on. Like any other non-executive director that you saw during the global financial crisis, most trustees, irrespective of which pension scheme they're in, which non-executive directorship they're taking, are interested in making sure they are able to justify themselves to the regulator should the scheme fail. And our trustees are no different. Our trustees, of course, are drawn from a range of different, especially the independent trustees are drawn from a range of different backgrounds, which include—
30 seconds, please, Deepa.
Thank you. Which include fossil fuel companies, the large investment banks, etc. All of them believe in a marketized narrative of cutting down defined benefit pensions, believing that DB pensions are unsustainable. And like the pensions regulator, want to go towards a scheme where there is least reliance on the pension protection fund. And that will happen by what they call de-risking, which is moving the scheme from assets which are growth assets like equities towards more guaranteed assets like bond market instruments. And this movement gives you certainty, but it also gives you certainty that you won't pay pensions in retirement. But they don't care about that because their objectives are largely about ensuring that the scheme doesn't go into the PPF and that the employer's future is sustainable. So on that rather depressing note, I'll hand back to Deborah.
Thank you, Deepa. Our next speaker is Justine Mercer from Warwick University on the Joint Negotiating Committee.
Thanks very much for that. I'm actually not chair of the JNC. I'm chair of UCU's side of the JNC, and that's important because I will talk about the independent chair. So the JNC is 11 people, 5 UUK nominees and 5 UCU nominees, plus an independent chair that both the employers and the union have to agree on. One appointee on each side is an official employed by UUK for the employers and UCU for the members. 3 of UCU's negotiators, along with 2 alternates, in case they can't attend, are elected annually by the Higher Education Sector Conference. And the vice president from the higher education sector can chair our side of the JNC if they're from a USS institution, or they can appoint an alternate. And the JNC's function is set out in the scheme rules, and broadly, it's to approve changes to the scheme rules, which they might initiate themselves or may come from the trustee board, and particularly to decide on contribution increases or decreases and or benefit changes under the cost sharing provisions of the scheme rules. And currently the cost sharing is such that 65% of the contributions are paid by the employers and 35% of the contributions are paid by members. Now, every 3 years, the trustee issues a report to the JNC, setting out what contributions are needed to pay for the pensions that have been built up to date and to maintain current benefits for the next 3 years when the next valuation takes place. The contributions are divided into deficit contributions, which the board claim are needed to fund past liabilities, past promises of pensions and future service rates. And that's important because we have argued that the employers should be solely responsible for any alleged deficit in the past. And the distinction, yes, that's important because we've argued that it should be only the future service that is cost shared with members. We usually meet monthly, but during the intense negotiations, we can meet weekly or even daily. The contribution rates set by the board are always higher than those that were set at the previous valuation, and employers routinely try to cut members' benefits so that the contribution rates come down. And I wanted to end by saying something about the so-called independent chair. In all valuations that have gone to a tied vote, the independent chair, to the best of my knowledge, certainly in recent memory, has voted in favour of the employer's proposals. And for that reason, they have gone through in all of the valuations that I am aware of. So that does call into question whether it's the right solution and how independent they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Again, one or two people are just joining us late. A reminder that this session is being recorded and you'll be able to hear it again at your leisure. Our next speaker is Marion Hersh from Glasgow University, who's talking about ethical pension investment. Marion.
Okay, as trade unionists, we want ethical pensions as well as good ones. I hope the first slide is up. Ethical and responsible investment. And responsible investment is about USS and other investors putting pressure on organisations to make changes in policies and practice. And this is obviously important and sometimes it can work. There are obviously organisations like Shell and Heathrow Airport where their main business is problematical and the appropriate thing is divestment. So you have ethical investment, which includes responsible investment, but also ethical decisions on investment. And I think the focus is often on the things you shouldn't invest in, but you can also look, well, how can positive investment decisions change things? And I realize I started with negative and that, you know, as people often do, and that in terms of things you shouldn't invest in, there's a whole range, only some of which I've covered here. You know, environmental, carbon, human rights, anti-discrimination, governance issues, you know, a well-run co-op better than an organisation which is hierarchical and lacks transparency, military technology, and so on. And obviously some are more generally accepted and others are more controversial. Positive investment decisions are about trying to achieve change, so things like green jobs, renewables, organisations looking at social change, organisations training disadvantaged groups to become activists. There's a whole range of possibilities which unfortunately don't have time to talk through.
30
next
seconds,
slide, please.
Marion.
Okay, UCU policy. I've been too long on the first bit. There's a lot of campaigning we can do, particularly on ethical investment. And and various opportunities to lobby USS. Moving to the last slide, USS is meeting with us every 6 months, but it's using its fiduciary duty as an excuse not to have an ethical investment policy. It's refused to make the ethical fund the default for DC defined contributions. It has a responsible investment policy, but it doesn't actually use it. For instance, it voted against the motion for a more ambitious climate policy at Shell AGM. So this was supported by 30%. It's done some carbon divestment, but this is financially rather than ethically driven. And it's got large carbon investments, for instance, in Heathrow Airport. And this is obviously irresponsible, and it's also a financial risk. So that sort of brings us back to the policy and the fact that we need a lot of work to move USS to actual ethical investment and to implement its responsible investment policy.
Thank you, Marion.
Sorry if that's overrun.
Thank you, Marion, for that. Our final speaker in this session is Ken Weir from Heriot Watt. How might inflation affect your pension?
Sorry, unmuting myself. Yeah, I've noticed we've run over, so I'll try and be quick here and concise. So as you know, inflation is something that can erode the value of an investment over time. But because the USS pension scheme is index linked, that means that to a certain degree, your benefits are inflation proofed. So what does that look like in practice? Well, the current USS scheme rules are that indexation is for every rise in the CPI, that's the Consumer Price Index, for every 1% rise in that, your benefits that are accrued to date will also be protected by 1% up into a total level of 5%. After that, there's a 0.5% protection rise for every 1%, and it goes up to a total of 10%. That's an upper ceiling. It's also referred to in various documents as a soft cap of 5%, and so on and so forth. So that's good to a certain extent. We know that because inflation in the UK has been historically low over the last 21 years. It's averaged under 2.5% over the last 30 years or so. However, what's about to change is that the UK proposal is going to change that indexation. It's going to change that inflation cap. As it currently stands, you're talking about removing the cap from 5% down to 2.5%. Now, this removes protection of benefits against inflation that is above 2.5%. As I mentioned, historically, it's been around 2.4% from 1989. The reason we use 1989 is because the Office for National Statistics has published the CPI data only from 1989 to the current time. And whilst it has been consistently low, there have been periods where it has peaked. So in 1991, for example, it peaked at 7.5%. That means that obviously in 1991, had we been looking at our pensions then, we would have taken a hit of about 5% on the value of benefits. We would lose inflation protection. And that's just something that's kind of, obviously this is historical data, but if we look forward, the forecasts now these days are kind of looking at higher inflation rates. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research, just as recent as the 1st of August, forecasted that the CPI will reach 3.9% for early 2022. So that means that in that period, for 2022, should it stay 3.9% inflation, that the value of your benefits would decrease by 1.4%. So all of this in brief means that the proposed UUK cap on inflation will ensure that benefits will not keep up with inflation above 2.5%, which is a risk to us as USS members, and it's a risk to your benefits because it means they will lose their value more quickly. Thanks.